Deep inside the deserts of Jordan stands a city that should never have survived. Petra had no river, almost no rain, and temperatures that could drain water from the land in days. Yet thousands of people lived here among fountains, gardens, baths, and crowded markets. Hidden inside the cliffs was a water system so advanced that it controlled both deadly floods and years of drought. Before we uncover how it worked, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy ancient mysteries, lost civilizations, and forgotten engineering. The first warning is not a cloud, but a sound. Somewhere beyond the walls of the sick, rain strikes the high sandstone country above Petra, perhaps many kilometers from the valley itself. For a time, nothing changes. Dust rests in the cracks. The rock faces rise almost vertically on either side. Then a low vibration begins to move through the stone. It deepens into a roar, and the empty passage suddenly becomes the path of a flood. Water loaded with mud, gravel, branches, and broken rock rushes into the confined canyon with astonishing speed. There may be no gentle rise and no long interval in which to escape. In a landscape where water seems almost absent, it can arrive as a wall. This is the central contradiction of Petra. The ancient city stands in a dry mountain basin in southern Jordan, hidden among cliffs and broken plateaus near the Arabian deserts. Its surroundings appear hostile to any large permanent population. Summer heat draws moisture rapidly from exposed ground. Rainfall is limited and irregular, and months can pass beneath clear skies. There is no broad river, lake, or dependable surface water around which an ordinary ancient city might grow. Yet when rain does fall, bare slopes and narrow wadis concentrate it violently. Petra faces two dangers that seem opposed but belong to the same problem: too little water for most of the year, and far too much during a few destructive hours. The city occupies the downstream end of the Wadi Musa catchment, where runoff from a wide upland area can be funneled toward the archaeological centre. Modern studies still describe Petra as highly exposed to flooding, and recent storms show that the old danger never disappeared. Channels remaining dry for long periods can become powerful torrents after intense rainfall. Sandstone, beautiful enough to make Petra seem carved from coloured light, is also vulnerable. Water opens fractures, strips surfaces, moves sediment, and weakens monuments. Geography gives Petra secrecy, drama, and defence while quietly arranging the conditions for disaster. To enter through the sick is to move through the narrowest point of that contradiction. The gorge is not simply a ceremonial corridor leading toward the treasury. It is a natural fracture through the mountain, lying along a route water seeks. In calm weather, the passage feels protected, its walls leaning inward until only a ribbon of sky remains. During a storm, the same confinement becomes dangerous. A flood that might spread across open ground is compressed into a channel, growing deeper and faster, with enough force to kill people and animals. Ancient visitors may have seen a majestic entrance. Those who lived there also understood it as a drainage artery and recurring threat. This makes Petra's later splendour difficult to explain by appearances alone. At its height, the city was not a temporary camp. It became the political and ceremonial centre of the Nabataean kingdom, filled with tombs, temples, houses, workshops, markets, gardens, and monumental spaces. Estimates of its population vary, and the evidence remains incomplete, but the settlement supported many thousands of inhabitants, merchants, travellers, pack animals, and caravans. Every person needed drinking water. Food preparation required more. Animals consumed heavily after desert journeys. Builders needed water for mortar and plaster, bathing, ritual life, craft production, and cultivated plants raised demand still further. The city did not merely endure in an arid valley. It developed the appearance of abundance. That abundance had to be created by treating the entire landscape as something that could be read, adjusted, and maintained. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, Petra's survival begins with a way of seeing unlike that of people accustomed to permanent rivers. In dry country, Water is not only a substance found in a spring or drawn from a well, it is a brief event moving across stone. It appears in clouds over distant ridges, in the angle of a slope, in dark stains on a cliff, and in sediment inside a hollow. To live here on an urban scale, the inhabitants must recognize water before it becomes visible. The sandstone adds another layer to the problem. Some surfaces send rain racing away. Others contain cracks where moisture gathers. Natural springs exist in the wider region, but they do not make every part of the city secure without storage and distribution. A wet year may renew reserves, while a sequence of poor years places the population under pressure. No surviving record reveals how often ancient Petra suffered shortage, and scholars still debate its population at different periods. What survives suggests not one perfect system operating unchanged for centuries, but a landscape repeatedly modified as the city grew, needs shifted, and failures exposed weaknesses. Petra's environment is never truly still. Wind moves sand through doorways and across carved steps. Storms cut gullies into slopes. Earthquakes shake fractured rock. Sediment accumulates in channels and behind barriers. A structure that works during one storm may be damaged by the next. Even successful control creates obligations, because collected water must be kept clean, stored, guided, divided, and protected from evaporation. Petra required constant attention to a resource that was both scarce and dangerous. The first communities who learned this country began with observation where runoff crossed a path, where water lingered after rain, where animals found moisture, where a cliff released a spring, and where a narrow valley magnified a storm. From those observations grew habits, then structures, then a system so extensive that much of it becomes almost invisible beside the carved facades. The monuments announce wealth. The waterworks explain how wealth could remain here at all. Seen from above, Petra is a basin surrounded by gathering slopes, a natural trap for movement, sediment, and water. The mountains that threaten to drown the valley also offer the possibility of supplying it. Rain that cannot be trusted as a steady source can still be captured as a sudden gift. Floodwater that can destroy a street can be redirected before reaching the city's heart. The solution demands generations of accumulated knowledge and a society capable of maintaining fragile works across difficult terrain. Before Petra can become a capital of stone, its people must turn danger into storage, absence into supply, and a place where water should vanish into one of the ancient world's most improbable cities. Long before Petra acquires temples, colonnaded streets, and monumental tombs, the people who will shape it are already experts in movement. The Nabataeans emerge from the broad cultural world of northern Arabia, where survival depends on reading distance, weather, pasture, wells, and the moods of the desert. Their early history remains difficult to reconstruct because they leave few written accounts of themselves, and outside observers usually notice them only when trade, taxation, or war brings them into view. What survives suggests communities that are mobile or partly mobile, skilled at crossing country that outsiders consider empty, and deeply familiar with water sources invisible from the horizon. This knowledge is more than a useful talent. It is a form of power. A caravan moving between southern Arabia, the Red Sea, the Levant, and the Mediterranean must pass through vast stretches where a missed spring can become fatal. Frankincense, myrrh, spices, textiles, bitumen, and metals may be valuable in distant markets, but they cannot move themselves. They require animals, guides, guards, food, negotiated passage, and above all water. Those who control the route between reliable supplies can influence where caravans travel and where they stop. By the 4th century before the Common Era, the Nabataeans appear clearly enough in surviving sources to alarm powerful neighbours. One early account describes them as people who resist fixed agriculture and permanent buildings, preferring a life that makes them difficult to conquer. The description is shaped by an outsider and may exaggerate their mobility, yet it preserves something important. The Nabataeans understand that a settlement can be captured, but hidden stores and dispersed groups are harder to seize. Their desert knowledge allows them to withdraw from armies that cannot carry enough water to follow. An attack by a Macedonian force in 312 before the Common Era reveals both their wealth and vulnerability. The Nabataeans are targeted because they possessed livestock, silver, and valuable trade goods. Their defenders suffer losses, but the expedition does not end in easy conquest. The invaders enter terrain where supply is uncertain and retreat becomes dangerous. The episode does not prove that Petra is already a fully developed capital. And scholars still debate how closely the early Nabataean centre corresponds to the later city. It does show that these desert communities are connected to exchange networks rich enough to attract imperial attention. Their rise comes from position as much as invention. Arabia produces aromatics desired in temples, courts, funerary rituals, and wealthy households across the ancient world. Goods arriving through Red Sea ports also travel northward. Petra lies near routes linking the Arabian interior with Gaza and other Mediterranean markets, while alternative paths lead toward Damascus, the Dead Sea, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. The surrounding mountains create a defensible refuge close to these commercial arteries. A secure centre hidden among cliffs can store wealth, shelter people, and command movement without standing exposed on an open plain. As trade expands, the Nabataeans begin to change. Mobility does not disappear, nor does knowledge of the desert lose its importance. Instead, those older skills become the foundation of a more complex state. Caravans need organized stopping points and agreements across long distances. Merchants need officials, guards, scribes, and judges. Goods need to be weighed, taxed, stored, and protected. Religious communities need sanctuaries. Royal authority needs places where alliances can be displayed and wealth made visible. A network once held together by seasonal movement increasingly requires permanent centres. Petra becomes the greatest of them. Its location allows the Nabataeans to combine concealment with access. Narrow approaches make direct assault difficult, while nearby routes connect the basin to a wider commercial world. The cliffs provide stone for construction and surfaces for carving. The valley offers space for markets, houses, public buildings, and sacred precincts. Yet every advantage carries the same unresolved cost. Each person drawn into the basin adds pressure to a water supply that nature does not provide steadily. A small community can adapt to uncertainty by moving. A capital cannot. Administrators cannot abandon records whenever a spring weakens. Craftsmen cannot repeatedly carry their workshops across the plateau. Temples, tombs, storehouses, and markets depend on people remaining in place. Caravans arriving with hundreds of animals cannot be told that the city's water has failed for the season. The transformation from mobile society to urban kingdom creates a new kind of risk. The Nabataeans are becoming wealthier because they master movement, but their wealth now depends on a city that must not move at all. This change is visible in the scale of investment. By the 1st century before the Common Era and the 1st century of the Common Era, Petra displays an architectural language shaped by contact with many regions. Hellenistic and Roman influences appear alongside local traditions. Monumental facades are cut into cliffs, not simply as graves but as statements of status, memory, and belonging. Public spaces become more elaborate. Coinage, inscriptions, and regional building projects point to a kingdom with rulers, institutions, and considerable resources. What survives in the record suggests that trade contributes greatly to this prosperity, although agriculture, herding, local production, and taxation also matter. The popular image of Petra as a city made rich only by incense caravans is too simple. Trade routes shift, markets change, and no kingdom of this size rests on a single commodity. Nabataean influence extends across settlements, farming zones, ports, and desert stations. They cultivate arid land where possible, manage herds, and participate in maritime as well as overland exchange. Their achievement lies not merely in carrying goods through emptiness, but in turning marginal landscapes into connected economic territory. Petra stands at the centre of that transformation. It is a royal city, a religious place, a commercial hub, and a symbol of permanence built by people whose earlier strength came partly from refusing permanence. Reliable water becomes the condition that allows the kingdom to display itself as stable. Every carved tomb and crowded market silently depends on it. Wealth may finance stonecutters and merchants, but wealth cannot replace drinking water. The richer Petra becomes. The more people it attracts, the more vulnerable it becomes to a failed spring, a damaged channel, or a season of weak rain. The Nabataeans have reached the point where their oldest knowledge must be transformed. It is no longer enough to remember where water appears. They must calculate where it moves, how long it can be held, and how an entire basin can be made to serve a city. The desert traders who once survived by following water are about to force water to follow them. The transformation begins not with a single aqueduct or dam, but with a different way of reading the mountains. To an outsider, the country around Petra appears chaotic broken ridges, narrow ravines, bare sandstone shelves, steep gullies, and valleys twisting without obvious order. To Nabataean engineers, every slope contains information. The angle of the ground predicts how quickly rain will move. The colour and texture of exposed rock suggest whether water will soak inward or rush across the surface. A thin line of vegetation may reveal persistent moisture. A fan of gravel at the mouth of a ravine records the violence of earlier floods. Even the sediment trapped behind a natural ledge can show how high water once rose and how much debris it carried. This knowledge does not depend on modern instruments, but it is not casual guesswork. It grows through generations of observation repeated across seasons. People who travel through dry country learn that the most important water often begins far from the place where it is finally needed. Rain may fall on a plateau while the city below remains under clear sky. Runoff then gathers in small channels, joins larger wadis, and accelerates toward the basin. Anyone standing only in Petra's centre sees the flood too late. To control it, engineers must understand the larger catchment, including ridges and valleys that lie beyond the visible city. The watershed becomes an invisible map spread across the mountains. High ground separates rain flowing toward Petra from rain escaping in other directions. A low saddle can divert water from one drainage into another. A narrow gorge can concentrate a broad sheet of runoff into a destructive torrent. A shallow depression can hold water briefly before it disappears into soil or evaporates. By tracing these relationships, the Nabataeans begin to treat the surrounding terrain as a connected hydraulic system, rather than a collection of isolated springs and channels. Such understanding is especially important because rainfall is irregular. Average annual figures can conceal the real problem. A year's rain does not arrive in equal, manageable portions. Much of it may fall during a handful of storms, and one violent event can produce more usable water than weeks of light drizzle. The challenge is therefore not simply to find water, but to predict its paths before it arrives. A barrier built in the wrong ravine collects little. A channel cut with the wrong slope either silts up or erodes itself apart. A reservoir placed too low may fill with mud before cleaner water reaches it. The evidence remains incomplete, but surviving structures show repeated attempts to match engineering decisions to specific local conditions. The sandstone landscape offers both opportunity and danger. Many surfaces are relatively impermeable when rain falls quickly, sending runoff downslope instead of allowing it to vanish immediately underground. This makes collection possible. Yet sandstone is also soft enough to cut and fragile enough to erode. Channels can be carved directly into cliffs, but unprotected edges wear away. Cavities can be enlarged into cisterns, but fractured ceilings may leak or collapse. Builders must distinguish between rock strong enough to hold water and rock likely to fail. In some places, plaster is needed to seal porous surfaces. In others, natural formations already provide part of the required structure. Springs add another layer to the map. The most important sources around Petra emerge where geological conditions bring underground water toward the surface. These are more dependable than storm runoff, but they are not necessarily close to every neighborhood or high enough to reach every destination easily. A spring may flow throughout much of the year while still varying with rainfall. Its water must be guided over distance without losing too much to leakage, evaporation, or contamination. Before a conduit is built, someone must determine whether the source stands above the intended destination and whether a workable route exists between them. Without precise surveying equipment, gradients can still be measured through practical methods. Water itself reveals level. Plumb lines establish vertical reference. Simple sighting tools and repeated tests help maintain a gentle fall across long distances. The work demands patience because the difference between success and failure can be small. A channel that descends too steeply allows water to race, damage plaster, and carry destructive sediment. One that falls too little may stagnate, overflow, or stop moving. Across broken terrain, the ideal route is rarely straight. It may follow contours, curve around cliffs, cross side valleys, and pass through cuttings before approaching the city. The engineers also have to think like flood water. During ordinary conditions, a shallow channel may seem adequate. During a storm, debris changes everything. Branches, stones, and sediment can block narrow openings. Water then rises behind the obstruction until it escapes in an unintended direction. A diversion wall that redirects moderate runoff may be overtopped by an exceptional flood. The system must survive events that occur only occasionally, but can destroy years of work in minutes. No single explanation fully accounts for how design standards were chosen, yet the repeated use of spillways, settling areas, and overflow paths suggest that failures were remembered and incorporated into later construction. This process is less like imposing a rigid design on nature than negotiating with it. The Nabataeans do not attempt to flatten every slope or force every stream into a straight line. They use natural ravines where those ravines are useful, block them where they are dangerous, and carve alternative paths where the terrain allows. A cliff may serve as one wall of a channel. A natural hollow may become the core of a reservoir. A saddle between hills may become a collection point. The landscape provides a rough hydraulic framework, and human labour refines it. Maintenance must already be considered at the moment of construction. A channel hidden behind masonry may be protected from sunlight and debris, but it still needs openings for inspection. A cistern must be reachable for cleaning. A dam must allow sediment to be removed or bypassed. Water systems fail not only because of poor design, but because people cannot reach the places where damage occurs. Petra's network therefore contains traces of access points, basins, and secondary routes that make sense only when viewed as parts of a system requiring constant human attention. What appears from a distance to be empty mountain country is gradually divided into zones of risk and opportunity. Some slopes become catchments, some gullies become drains, some springs become permanent supply lines. Some ravines are treated as enemies to be diverted before they reach inhabited areas. The city's water system begins far beyond its monuments, scattered across ridges where almost no visitor looks. Petra's survival depends on decisions made high above the valley, where rain first touches stone and where a few carefully placed walls can determine whether the water arrives as a resource or as a disaster. Once the mountains have been read, the next problem is speed. Rain does not wait for workers to guide it. It lands on the high country, spreads across bare stone, and begins moving downhill almost immediately. In a humid landscape, part of that water might soak slowly into deep soil or remain in streams for days. Around Petra, much of it appears as a brief pulse. If it is not intercepted during those first minutes and hours, it escapes into ravines, sinks into gravel, evaporates under the returning sun, or arrives in the city as a destructive flood. The Nabataean answer is to meet water before it gathers too much force. Across the wider landscape, they build small walls rather than relying only on a few monumental dams. These barriers cross shallow gullies, narrow channels, and sloping fields. Some slow runoff just enough for sediment to settle. Others divert it sideways toward cultivated ground or collection points. A single wall may seem insignificant, yet dozens of structures distributed across a catchment can alter the behaviour of an entire storm. Water that would have rushed directly into a wadi is delayed, divided, and spread across a longer route. This distributed approach is one of the system's most surprising strengths. It does not depend on one structure remaining perfect. If a minor barrier fails, the whole network does not necessarily collapse. Other walls still slow the flow, and overflow can pass toward lower installations. The design is layered. Each intervention handles part of the problem, before handing the remaining water to the next. What survives in the record suggests a landscape managed through accumulation, many modest structures working together rather than a single dramatic machine. Terraces are central to that strategy. On steeper uneven ground, they create flatter surfaces where water loses velocity and soil can gather. Stone-retaining walls hold back sediment carried from higher slopes, gradually forming pockets of cultivable earth. This is not irrigation in the image of a broad river feeding endless canals. It is careful manipulation of runoff, often at the scale of individual storms and small fields. Moisture is encouraged to remain where plants can use it, while excess water is allowed to continue onward. Such terraces support more than crops. They stabilize slopes that might otherwise erode into the channels below. Every load of sediment kept on a hillside is sediment that does not clog a conduit or reservoir. Agriculture and hydraulic protection therefore become part of the same system. A field wall helps feed people, but it also protects urban infrastructure farther downstream. The connection is easy to miss because the structures may lie beyond the famous monuments. Yet Petra's water security begins in these less visible working landscapes. Diversion walls handle the opposite problem. Instead of holding water back, they send it away from danger. Built at angles across gullies or along the edges of slopes, they steer runoff toward channels designed to receive it. Their success depends on placement. Water striking a wall directly with too much force can undermine its base or tear through the masonry. A wall that turns the flow gradually survives better than one that simply resists it. Nabataean builders appear to have understood that controlling a flood often means redirecting energy rather than attempting to stop it completely. The larger dams are placed where topography provides leverage. A narrow gap between rock faces allows a relatively short barrier to intercept water from a much wider drainage area. Behind it, runoff can spread and slow, dropping stones and coarse sediment before moving through an outlet or into a secondary channel. These dams are not identical in purpose. Some protect inhabited zones, some create temporary storage, some regulate the amount entering a downstream conduit. Their forms vary because each ravine presents a different combination of slope, rock, and flood volume. No ancient engineer can know precisely how large the next storm will be. This uncertainty shapes the system. Spillways and overflow routes are essential because a dam designed only to hold water eventually becomes a trap for its own destruction. When the basin fills, excess flow must escape without cutting around the wall or collapsing it. Evidence for exact construction phases is uneven, and scholars still debate the dating of individual features. But repeated repairs suggest that builders learned from damage. A breached wall could be rebuilt thicker, extended into stronger rock, or paired with a new diversion upstream. Rock-cut catchments take advantage of the sandstone itself. Shallow basins, channels, and smooth surfaces collect water from exposed slopes and direct it towards storage openings. The catchment may be natural in outline but carefully modified at its edges. Small ridges keep runoff from spilling away. Grooves converge like branches toward a trunk. In some places, plaster reduces leakage and prevents loose sand from contaminating the flow. The work is precise but not necessarily conspicuous. A visitor can cross a collection surface without realizing that the ground has been shaped to harvest rain. Cleanliness matters from the beginning. The first water from a storm washes dust, animal waste, leaves, and loose debris from the landscape. Sending all of it directly into storage would quickly foul the supply. Settling areas and preliminary basins allow heavier material to drop before water continues. Some flows may have been used for fields or animals rather than drinking. The evidence does not preserve every rule of operation, but the separation of channels and basins suggests deliberate choices about water quality. Human labour remains the hidden force behind every successful storm. Before the rains, channels must be cleared, walls inspected, cracks sealed, and sediment removed. Afterward, damaged sections need repair before the next event. A neglected catchment can fail even when its original design is sound. Petra's system therefore depends on organised maintenance extending beyond the urban centre. Workers must travel across slopes, monitor remote structures, and understand how one obstruction can create problems kilometres away. By the time runoff approaches the city, it has already passed through a chain of decisions. Some water has been spread across fields, some has been slowed behind terraces, some has been diverted away from dangerous routes, some has been cleaned of its heavier sediment. What remains can be guided toward places where it will be held against the long dry season. The storm may last only an afternoon, but the Nabataeans are preparing to make its water endure for months. The rain has now been slowed, divided, and guided, but capture alone does not solve Petra's problem. A storm may fill channels for a few hours, while the city must drink for months. The real achievement begins when moving water disappears underground, across the valleys and slopes around Petra. Openings cut into stone led toward chambers that are easy to overlook from the surface. Some are no more than dark shafts beside a path. Others lie behind walls, beneath courtyards, or inside cliffs. Together, these cisterns turn the brief violence of rain into something quieter and far more valuable time. A cistern is not simply a hole that happens to hold water. Its location, shape, lining, entrance, and connection to the catchment all determine whether the contents remain usable. Nabataean builders enlarge natural cavities where possible, and carve new chambers where the rock permits. Many widen below a relatively narrow opening, creating underground spaces that can store substantial volumes while exposing little surface area to the sun. In a region where heat can remove water rapidly from an open pool, darkness is part of the technology. The surrounding rock acts as insulation. Temperatures inside a deep chamber remain more stable than those outside, reducing evaporation and protecting the stored water from the most extreme heat. A small mouth can be covered with stone or timber, limiting sunlight and wind. It also keeps animals from falling inside and prevents loose debris from blowing across the surface. The stored water is hidden not because secrecy is always the main purpose, but because concealment improves survival. Yet hiding water creates its own difficulties. Someone must be able to reach it. Shafts, steps, and access passages allow people to lower containers or enter during cleaning. Some cisterns preserve footholds cut into their sides. Others have stairways descending toward the changing water level. As the dry season continues and the surface falls, the chamber must remain accessible without forcing users to climb dangerously down smooth rock. These practical details reveal that the reservoirs are not passive spaces. They're entered, inspected, emptied, repaired, and used repeatedly. The sandstone often requires sealing. Water can escape through pores and fractures too small to notice when the chamber is dry. Nabataean workers coat internal surfaces with hydraulic plaster, made from lime and aggregates chosen to resist prolonged dampness. Multiple layers may be applied, with repairs added when cracks appear. The surviving plaster is sometimes more informative than the chamber itself, recording long use through patches of different texture and composition. A reservoir can look ancient and permanent, yet its ability to hold water depends on a thin human-made skin. This lining must withstand more than leakage. Sediment settles on the floor, dissolved salts move through the walls, earth tremors open fractures, repeated wetting and drying weaken surfaces. If plaster peels away, stored water can vanish slowly into the rock long before anyone notices the loss from above. Maintenance crews therefore become as important as the original builders. The evidence remains incomplete. But the scale of Petra's storage network implies organised labour and accumulated knowledge of materials, not occasional improvisation by isolated households. Water quality is equally difficult to preserve, Every catchment carries dust, soil, insects, plant material, and animal waste. The first muddy surge after a dry period is especially contaminated. Channels and settling basins remove some of this material before the water reaches storage, but no ancient system can eliminate it completely. Inside the cistern, heavier particles sink, leaving clearer water above. Users must draw carefully to avoid stirring the bottom, while periodic cleaning removes the thick layer that gradually accumulates. Some chambers may have served different purposes according to the quality of their supply. Water from a protected spring could be preferred for drinking. Runoff collected from roofs or cleaner rock surfaces might serve households. More turbid water could be reserved for animals, construction, gardens, or washing. Archaeology rarely preserves labels explaining these distinctions, and scholars still debate how individual installations were managed. Even so, Petra's many storage points suggest flexibility rather than a single undifferentiated reserve. That flexibility is vital because one enormous central reservoir would create dangerous dependence. If it cracked, became polluted, or failed to fill, the city would face catastrophe. Numerous cisterns spread across neighborhoods, hillsides, agricultural zones, and caravan routes divide the risk. A failed chamber does not empty every reserve. Water can be stored close to where it will be used, reducing the labor required to transport it. Remote installations can support travelers, herders, and workers before they reach the urban center. Some cisterns also have strategic value. Hidden desert reservoirs allow people familiar with their locations to travel through country where outsiders see no supply. Earlier Nabataean survival may have depended partly on such concealed knowledge. An invading army can seize a visible spring, but it cannot easily control chambers whose entrances resemble cracks in the rock. By the time Petra grows into a capital, that older tradition of protected storage has expanded into an urban necessity. Ownership and access must have shaped daily life. Although the social arrangements are only partly understood, certain cisterns likely belong to households, estates, religious complexes, or public facilities. Others may serve broader communities. The person responsible for opening a reservoir during shortage holds considerable influence. Water must be allocated, guarded, and sometimes rationed. Petra's apparent abundance therefore rests on rules that leave few direct traces in stone. The city's hidden chambers also complicate modern attempts to estimate its capacity. Many cisterns remain buried, damaged, or difficult to identify. Others have lost their roofs or connections, making their original volume uncertain. Counts vary depending on how researchers define separate installations. No single calculation can reveal exactly how many people Petra could support in every period, because rainfall, spring flow, leakage, usage, and maintenance all changed over time. What survives is enough to overturn the image of a city waiting helplessly for rain. Petra stores water at multiple scales, from small domestic tanks to large chambers carved deep into rock. The visible city rises in facades, columns, and stairways, but its endurance lies below eye level. During the dry months, when channels fall silent and the surrounding slopes return to dust, life continues because the storms have not truly vanished. They remain in darkness beneath the stone, held in reserve one chamber at a time. The hidden cisterns can preserve water after a storm, but before any of them can be filled safely, Petra must survive the storm itself. Nowhere is that danger more concentrated than in the Sikh. The narrow gorge appears to be a natural corridor for ceremony, where the world closes to a ribbon of sky before opening onto the treasury. Yet the same geometry that creates spectacle also creates a hydraulic trap. The cliffs gather runoff from the uplands. The confined walls prevent water from spreading, and the descending passage accelerates whatever enters it. In calm weather, the Sikh is an entrance. In heavy rain, it becomes a weapon pointed at the center of the city. The threat begins beyond the visible gorge, in the drainage channels feeding Wadi Musa. Rain falling on the surrounding plateau gathers in folds of terrain and moves toward the narrow opening. By the time it reaches the head of the Sikh, separate flows have joined into a single mass carrying mud, stones, uprooted plants, and fragments of collapsing slope. A deeper torrent in a passage only a few meters wide has enough force to smash animals against rock and bury lower spaces beneath sediment. For Petra to grow, this natural route must be altered. The Nabataeans build a dam near the entrance to the Sikh, not to create a permanent lake but to intercept the dangerous flow before it enters the gorge. Water is redirected through a rock-cut tunnel toward an alternative channel, allowing the main passage to remain usable, while floodwater is sent around the most vulnerable urban approach. The dam must withstand the first impact of the torrent, while the diversion must accept a sudden volume without clogging or forcing water back toward the city. The tunnel is one of the clearest examples of Petra's engineers working with geology, rather than merely placing walls on the surface. Cutting through rock creates a route less exposed than an open channel, and allows the water to bypass the amok's narrowest section. Yet a tunnel is not safe simply because it is enclosed. Its entrance can be blocked by debris, its floor can erode, sediment can reduce its capacity over time. If water rises faster than it can pass through, the dam becomes a temporary reservoir, and pressure begins to build against every weakness. The diversion works only as part of a larger defensive landscape. Upstream barriers slow some runoff before it reaches the main dam. Settling areas trap heavy material. Channels guide smaller flows towards storage or agricultural ground. The tunnel handles what remains, but its survival depends on all the structures above it. A damaged terrace kilometers away can release extra sediment. A blocked side channel can send a new surge toward the dam. Petra's flood control is therefore not a single heroic construction, but a chain of measures, each reducing the burden on the next. Along the walls of the Sikva's rock-cut water channels reveal another contradiction. The gorge must be protected from uncontrolled water, while also carrying controlled water toward the city. Channels run along both sides at different heights and in different forms. Some are open troughs carved into the sandstone. Others once held ceramic pipes or were covered to reduce contamination and evaporation. Water moving gently through these conduits follows the same corridor where floodwater, if left unmanaged, would rush with destructive force. The distinction is one of speed and discipline. A managed flow descends along a calculated gradient, contained within a narrow path. A flood follows gravity without restraint, searching for every low point and weakness. The Nabataean system does not remove water from the Sikh, it separates useful water from dangerous water. One is admitted in measured quantities, the other is diverted before it can take control of the passage. This separation must be maintained constantly. Dust, gravel, and fragments falling from the cliffs accumulate in open channels. Roots enter cracks, plaster loosens, ceramic sections shift. At the dam, sediment gathers behind the barrier, reducing the space available during the next storm. Workers have to clear approaches, inspect walls, repair linings, and remove obstructions from the tunnel. Its safety depends on repeated human effort. A neglected season can undo decades of careful construction. The protection of the passage is therefore never complete, only renewed after every season of damage. There is also no guarantee that every flood can be contained. Exceptional storms exceed ordinary expectations, and the geological record around Petra preserves episodes of severe runoff. Scholars still debate the dates and phases of some hydraulic features, partly because structures were repaired, rebuilt, and altered across long periods. What survives suggests adaptation rather than flawless mastery. The Nabataeans learn where water breaks through, where sediment accumulates, and where walls require reinforcement. Failure is not absent from the system. It becomes one of the ways the system evolves. The Sikh also carries symbolic weight. Anyone entering Petra passes beside evidence that the city has imposed order on a dangerous landscape. Channels cut into the walls bring water inward, while the flood diversion keeps destruction away. The same gorge that could isolate Petra becomes a controlled threshold, announcing that its people understand the mountains more intimately than visitors do. Monumental architecture begins before the treasury appears. Not in a carved facade, but in the disciplined behaviour of water. Yet the arrangement remains fragile. If the upstream dam fails, The sick can return instantly to its natural role. Modern floods have repeatedly demonstrated how quickly the passage can become dangerous, even after centuries of engineering and later intervention. Water does not remember that the gorge is a tourist route, a ceremonial entrance, or an archaeological treasure. It follows slope and confinement as it always has. For the ancient city, controlling the sick means more than protecting a road. It protects the markets, temples, houses, and public spaces lying beyond the narrow passage. It also preserves the channels carrying fresh water toward those same places. Petra's entrance is therefore both artery and shield. The Nabataeans must keep beneficial flow moving through it, while forcing destructive flow elsewhere, balancing two forms of the same element within a few meters of stone. Only after that balance is achieved can water travel deeper into the city, where distance, elevation, and pressure create a new set of problems. Once the flood water has been pushed away from the Seek, a quieter stream begins its own journey toward Petra. This water does not arrive in a violent surge from the sky. It emerges from springs in the surrounding highlands, where rain has filtered through rock and returned to the surface at points controlled by geology. These sources are more dependable than storm runoff, but dependence does not mean abundance. Their flow varies, their distance from the city creates risk, and every meter between spring and reservoir offers another chance for water to leak, evaporate, become contaminated, or stop moving altogether. The principal spring associated with Petra is Ain Musa, traditionally linked with the biblical figure of Moses and located above the ancient city near modern Wadi Musa. Other sources, including Ain Brag, also contribute to the wider supply network. The exact roles of individual springs change across time, and the evidence remains incomplete. But the surviving conduits reveal a system designed to bring water from higher ground into districts that cannot rely on local collection alone. The city's engineers are not merely storing rain, they are extending the reach of the landscape's natural plumbing. Gravity provides the power. There are no mechanical pumps driving water uphill toward Petra. The spring must begin above the destination, and the conduit must descend continuously enough for flow to continue. This sounds simple until the route crosses fractured mountains, side valleys, cliff faces, and unstable slopes. A straight line is impossible. The channel must bend around obstacles while preserving a small but consistent fall. Every curve lengthens the journey, and every change in elevation must be managed without allowing the current to race or stall. Surveying therefore becomes one of the hidden arts behind Petra's survival. Builders can use sighting instruments, plumb lines, levelling frames, and water-filled vessels to compare heights across short distances. Long routes are established through repeated measurements rather than a single calculation. A mistake made near the spring may not become obvious until far downstream, where the channel suddenly sits too low to reach its intended destination or too high to maintain flow. Correcting such an error can require cutting a new path through stone. Along sections of the route, conduits are carved directly into sandstone. These open channels follow the contours of cliffs, sometimes appearing as shallow grooves and sometimes as deeper troughs. Their placement reflects a compromise between efficiency and protection. A higher channel can preserve elevation for longer, allowing water to reach raised parts of the city, but it may be more difficult to construct and maintain. A lower route is easier to access but loses hydraulic potential. The engineers must decide not only where the water can travel but where it may eventually be needed. Open channels expose water to dust, animals, sunlight, and falling debris. In some locations, stone slabs cover the conduit. Elsewhere, masonry encloses it, or a ceramic pipeline is fitted into a rock-cut bed. Covering reduces contamination and evaporation, but it also makes blockages harder to see. Inspection openings are therefore necessary at intervals. These points allow workers to remove sediment, repair damaged sections, and determine where flow has been interrupted. A conduit that cannot be reached is a conduit waiting to fail. Ceramic pipes offer further control. Individual sections are shaped to fit together, commonly with a narrower end inserted into the wider mouth of the next piece. Joints are sealed with mortar or another binding material to reduce leakage. The pipes can protect water from direct contact with the surrounding ground and allow it to pass through sections where an open channel would be vulnerable. Yet pottery is brittle. earth movement, falling rocks, pressure changes, or careless maintenance can crack a segment and drain the supply into the slope. Mineral deposits create a slower danger. Spring water carries dissolved substances that accumulate along the inner surface of channels and pipes. Over time, these deposits narrow the passage, reducing capacity and altering flow. Sediment entering at the source or through damaged covers adds to the obstruction. The system must be cleaned repeatedly, and pipe sections may need replacement. What appears today as a fixed ancient installation was once a living piece of infrastructure. Constantly opened, scraped, patched, and rebuilt. Gradient is the controlling principle throughout. If water moves too slowly, sediment settles and stagnant pools form. If it moves too quickly, the current damages plaster, erodes sandstone, and places stress on joints. At sharp descents, small basins or drops can dissipate energy. At bends, wider sections reduce turbulence. The Nabataeans may not describe these principles in surviving technical texts, but their structures show practical awareness of them. The engineering is empirical, refined through observation and the memory of what failed. Crossing a side valley presents a special challenge. A conduit following a contour can suddenly meet a ravine cutting across its path. Builders may guide the channel around the head of the ravine, extending the route but preserving a gentle slope. They may construct a supporting wall or bridge across the gap. In some cases, a closed pipe can descend and rise again if pressure is sufficient, forming an inverted siphon. Such systems are technically demanding, and scholars still debate the interpretation of certain remains around Petra, but the possibility shows how far the engineers may have gone to protect elevation. Water approaching the city does not necessarily enter one single main line. Branches can direct it toward reservoirs, fountains, neighborhoods, religious complexes, or public buildings. Control points regulate distribution. A small change in the height of an outlet determines which basin fills first. Overflow from one installation may feed another below it. The network therefore operates as a hierarchy, with gravity quietly establishing priorities across the city. This arrangement also reflects social choices. Water delivered to a monumental fountain is water not immediately sent to a household tank. Water directed toward a garden may serve prestige while residents elsewhere depend on more modest cisterns. The physical network cannot reveal every decision behind allocation, but it shows that supply is managed rather than simply released. Someone determines when channels are opened, when reservoirs are cleaned, and which destinations receive the strongest flow. By the time spring water reaches Petra's center, it has traveled through a route cut, covered, sealed, and measured across difficult country. Its gentle movement conceals the labor required to keep it moving at all. The aqueducts do not conquer gravity. They depend on it with extraordinary precision. Every carved groove and fitted pipe preserves just enough descent to carry life toward the city. Yet as the water drops from high springs into lower districts, gravity begins to create a new danger. The force that makes the system possible can also burst its pipes, scour its channels, and turn a controlled supply into another form of destruction. By the time water reaches the inhabited center of Petra, the greatest danger is no longer simply losing it. The city must decide what happens next. A spring-fed conduit, a storm channel, and a household catchment do not deliver water of equal quality or at equal speed. Some flows arrive clear and steady, others carry suspended sand, fragments of plaster, organic debris, and the fine reddish silt washed from sandstone. If all of these sources were allowed to pour directly into drinking reservoirs or public fountains, the network would become dirty, unpredictable, and difficult to control. Petra therefore needs places where water can pause before it continues. Settling basins perform this first act of discipline. A channel widens or empties into a chamber where the current slows, allowing heavier particles to fall to the bottom. Clearer water then leaves through an outlet positioned above the sediment layer. The principle is simple, but its success depends on careful proportions. If the basin is too small, water crosses it before the mud can settle. If the outlet sits too low, sediment is drawn onward. If the chamber has no accessible floor, accumulated material eventually fills the space and destroys its function. These basins require regular cleaning, especially after storms. Workers enter when the flow is reduced, shovel out mud and gravel, repair damaged plaster, and clear the outlet. The removed sediment may be discarded or used where fine material is useful, but its presence inside the basin is a constant reminder that every captured storm brings both water and landscape with it. Petra's channels are not merely carrying a liquid, they are transporting pieces of the mountains. Some installations use more than one chamber. Water passes through a first basin where coarse debris settles, then into a second where finer particles are removed. This stage treatment does not produce water in the modern sense of purification, and contamination from microbes remains beyond ancient understanding. Yet it improves clarity, reduces unpleasant material, and protects downstream pipes from blockage. What survives in the record suggests that the Nabataeans understand water quality through appearance, taste, smell, and practical experience, even if they cannot explain disease in scientific terms. After settling, water often enters distribution tanks positioned at points where one supply must serve several destinations. These tanks act as hydraulic crossroads. A single incoming channel may feed multiple outlets cut at different heights or angles. The arrangement allows water to be divided between neighbourhoods, gardens, public structures, and storage chambers. An outlet placed lower begins receiving water first. A higher one activates only when the tank reaches a certain level. In this way, the geometry of the basin itself can establish priority without requiring constant human adjustment. Such priority may protect essential supply. A low outlet could feed a drinking reservoir, while overflow from a higher opening continues toward decorative or agricultural use. The exact purpose of every surviving branch is not always clear, and scholars still debate how specific tanks function during different periods. Even so, the system demonstrates that Petra does not treat all demand as equal. Water for survival, commerce, ritual, comfort, and display moves through the same landscape, but it need not receive the same place in the order of distribution. Overflow controls are essential because no tank can accept unlimited inflow. When a reservoir fills, water must leave safely. Without a planned escape route, it spills over the weakest wall, erodes foundations, or floods nearby buildings. Nabataean builders cut overflow channels slightly above the normal storage level, allowing excess water to pass into another basin or return to a drainage route. A full reservoir, therefore, does not always mark the end of the system. It may become the beginning of a second supply line. This cascading arrangement makes gravity useful more than once. Water fills a higher tank, serves users at that elevation, and then continues toward lower districts. One volume can pass through several stages before leaving the urban network. It may first supply a fountain, then overflow into a garden channel, and finally collect in a lower cistern for animals or cleaning. Not every drop necessarily follows such an elaborate sequence, but the principle reduces waste and allows water that has already performed one function to remain useful. Control gates or removable barriers may regulate certain branches. A channel can be blocked temporarily so another reservoir fills, or opened during maintenance to drain a section. Stone plugs, wooden elements, and small sluice-like arrangements rarely survive intact, making their operation difficult to reconstruct. The physical channels nevertheless show points where flow could be interrupted or redirected. A city dependent on water cannot afford a network that continues moving blindly during repairs. Maintenance points are therefore built into the route: inspection openings, access shafts, removable covers, and small chambers allow workers to reach places where sediment and mineral deposits gather. At changes in direction, debris is more likely to settle. At junctions, pressure and turbulence can damage plaster. At the entrance to a pipe, a screen or narrow opening may stop larger objects while creating a place that must be cleaned frequently. These features reveal an important truth. Petra's water system is designed not only to work, but to be worked on. The labour may have been organised at several levels. Households probably maintain domestic cisterns and roof catchments. Estate owners oversee agricultural channels. Religious authorities may control water-serving temples or sacred precincts. Royal or civic administrators are likely responsible for major aqueducts, dams, and public reservoirs. Direct evidence for these administrative arrangements is limited, but the network's scale makes coordination unavoidable. Someone must know which channel feeds which basin, who closes a branch during repairs, and how long a district can depend on stored reserves. Seasonal planning also shapes operation. After rainfall, runoff storage may be plentiful but cloudy. During the dry months, the city relies increasingly on spring-fed conduits and cisterns filled earlier in the year. A reservoir may be held back as emergency supply rather than opened immediately. Gardens can receive less water during shortage. Public display may be reduced, although no surviving record describes exactly how Petra rationed its reserves. The system's complexity gives administrators choices that a single well could never provide. This flexibility turns uncertain sources into a more dependable whole. Rain, springs, household catchments, agricultural runoff, and stored reserves support one another. When one source weakens, another can carry part of the demand. Settling basins protect quality. Distribution tanks divide flow. Overflow channels prevent destructive excess. Maintenance access keeps the entire structure from slowly sealing itself with silt and mineral crust. Petra's reliability is therefore not the result of finding one miraculous source in the desert. It comes from controlling transitions from fast water to slow water, from dirty water to clearer water, from a single channel to many destinations, and from surplus to storage. The city survives because its engineers refuse to let water move without consequence. At nearly every stage, it is slowed, measured, redirected, or held. Yet the more tightly flow is controlled, the more the network must confront the force building inside enclosed conduits. Order solves one problem and quietly creates another. The moment water enters a closed pipe, gravity changes character. In an open channel, excess force can escape upward as splashing, turbulence, or overflow. Inside a sealed conduit, that force becomes pressure against the walls, joints, bends, and weak points of the system. Petra's steep terrain makes this both useful and dangerous. Water descending from a high spring gains the ability to cross low ground and rise again on the opposite side, but it can also burst ceramic pipes, separate poorly sealed joints, and drain an entire supply line into the hillside before the failure is discovered. This is the pressure problem beneath Petra. The city is spread across uneven ground, with high terraces, lower valleys, cliffside structures, and neighborhoods occupying different elevations. A simple gravity channel works well when the route can descend gently from source to destination. It becomes far more difficult when a ravine interrupts the path, or when water must reach a point higher than the lowest ground between them. Going around every depression preserves open flow, but it can add great distance and require extensive cutting. Crossing directly may demand a pressurized pipe operating as an inverted siphon. In such a system, water descends through a closed conduit into the bottom of a valley. The weight of the water behind it creates enough pressure to push the flow upward along the far side, provided the outlet remains below the original source level and the pipe can survive the stress. The water is not being pumped. Gravity is still doing the work, but it is doing so through pressure rather than a continuously descending surface. Ancient engineers elsewhere in the Mediterranean use similar methods, yet applying them in Petra's fractured sandstone presents unusual risks. Ceramic pipes can carry modest pressure, especially when sections are thick. Carefully fitted and well supported, their joints remain vulnerable. Each connection is a potential leak, and a long line may contain hundreds of them. A slight mismatch between two sections allows water to escape under force. Mortar can seal the gap, but repeated pressure changes. Earth movement and mineral growth weaken the bond. Once a leak begins, water may erode the surrounding bedding, creating space for the pipe to shift and making the failure worse. The shape of pipe joints reflects attempts to reduce this danger. Narrow ends fit into wider sockets, directing flow through overlapping sections rather than against a simple edge-to-edge seam. Mortar or sealing compounds reinforce the connection. Pipes may be laid inside carved trenches and surrounded by masonry to prevent movement. Where pressure is expected to be greatest, stronger materials are preferable. Evidence from parts of Petra's network has led researchers to consider whether metal pipes, particularly lead, were used in demanding sections. Although the interpretation and full extent of such systems remain debated, pressure is highest near the lowest point of a siphon, where the vertical difference from the source creates the greatest force. This is precisely where repair may be most difficult. The conduit can lie beneath accumulated sediment or later construction. A rupture at the bottom drains water rapidly, while the visible symptom may appear far away as a sudden loss of flow at the outlet. Workers must trace the line, inspect access points, and determine whether the problem is a blockage, a broken joint, or an empty source. Air introduces another complication. Trapped pockets inside a closed conduit can interrupt flow, produce surges, and increase stress as water compresses and moves around them. High points may require vents, while low points need ways to remove sediment. If the system fills too quickly after being empty, water can strike trapped air and create a sudden pressure shock. Modern engineers call a related effect water hammer. There is no evidence that Nabataean builders described it in those terms, but repeated experience would reveal that abrupt changes damage pipes. The system therefore benefits from header tanks placed before steep descents. Water first enters an open basin, where its level stabilizes and excess flow can escape through an overflow. From there, the closed conduit begins under more controlled conditions. At the far end, a receiving tank allows pressure to dissipate before water enters open channels or reservoirs. These tanks separate the dangerous pressurized section from the more fragile distribution network beyond it. Even open aqueducts face destructive force on steep slopes. A channel descending too sharply becomes a chute. Water accelerates, scours its lining, and cuts into the sandstone below. Builders can reduce this energy through steps, small drops, widened basins, and changes in direction. Each interrupts the flow and converts some of its speed into turbulence before the water continues. The solution looks inefficient because it deliberately slows water, but speed is not the goal. Delivery without damage is. Leakage cannot be eliminated entirely. Some water escapes through plaster, joints, cracks, and porous rock. The relevant question is whether the loss remains small enough for the system to function. A conduit that leaks slightly may continue serving the city for years. One that crosses unstable ground can fail repeatedly. Repairs visible along some channels suggest that ancient maintenance crews accepted imperfection and patched vulnerable sections rather than rebuilding the entire route. Earthquakes make this compromise more precarious. Petra lies in a tectonically active region where seismic events can shift walls, fracture rock, and alter gradients. A channel displaced by only a small amount may no longer flow correctly. A ceramic pipeline that survives ordinary pressure can break when the ground beneath one section settles. Major earthquakes affecting Petra in later centuries damage buildings and infrastructure alike. But smaller tremors may have required continual adjustment long before any famous disaster. Mineral deposits create a different kind of pressure problem. As the inner diameter of a pipe narrows, the same supply must pass through less space. Flow slows in some places and becomes more forceful in others. Rough deposits increase turbulence and collect sediment. Cleaning a closed pipe is difficult unless sections can be opened or replaced. The network must therefore be built with the expectation that its internal shape will change over time. No surviving manual explains how Nabataean engineers calculated these forces. Scholars still debate how much of the system was pressurized, which materials were used, and whether some apparent siphons are better understood as alternative channel arrangements. What survives in the record suggests practical experimentation supported by knowledge circulating across the Hellenistic and Roman worlds. Yet the final solutions are adapted to Petra's specific terrain rather than copied without alteration. The contradiction remains striking. Gravity makes the entire supply possible, but too much of it concentrated over a steep descent threatens to tear the system apart. The engineers must preserve enough force to move water across broken ground while releasing enough force to protect the conduits. Every tank, bend, joint, and drop becomes part of that negotiation. Petra's hidden network does not work because pressure is absent. It works because pressure is anticipated, divided, and, where possible, persuaded to spend itself harmlessly before reaching the city. Once water has survived the descent into Petra, passed through settling tanks, and escaped the dangers of pressure, it begins to do something that seems almost unreasonable. It appears in the open after so much effort has been spent hiding it from heat, dirt, and evaporation. Water is allowed to move through fountains, pools, baths, gardens, and ceremonial spaces where part of it will inevitably be lost. In a city surrounded by dry stone, this is not carelessness. It is a declaration. Petra's rulers are showing that they possess enough control over the desert to use water for beauty as well as necessity. The contrast would have been immediate. Travellers approach through country where every skin of drinking water matters, then enter a capital where channels murmur beside roads and planted spaces soften the sandstone. Monumental facades rise from cliff-streaked red, gold, and violet, while cultivated greenery occupies carefully maintained pockets of soil. Even a modest fountain becomes extraordinary in this setting. It does not need to compete with a great river or a rainy climate. Its significance comes from the apparent impossibility of its presence. Near the centre of Petra, the structure commonly called the Nymphaeum once stood close to the meeting of important routes and water channels. Its surviving remains are fragmentary, but it appears to have formed a monumental public fountain associated with a large tree in a prominent urban space. Water here is not merely collected in darkness. It becomes part of the city's architecture, linked to movement, shade, social gathering, and civic identity. People passing through the area would see and hear the supply that made urban life possible. Public fountains serve several purposes at once. They offer access to water, although the exact rules governing who may draw from them remain unknown. They cool the surrounding air slightly through evaporation. They create gathering places where residents exchange information and observe public life. They also carry political meaning. A fountain that flows reliably suggests competent authority. Its failure announces weakness more visibly than an empty underground cistern. The rulers and administrators who maintain such structures attach their legitimacy to the continued movement of water. The most dramatic evidence for deliberate display lies farther inside the city, in the complex known as the Petra Garden and Pool Complex. Archaeologists have uncovered remains suggesting an elaborate garden associated with a monumental pool and pavilion in the city centre. The pool was not a small household basin. Its size and formal setting indicate that water was being used on a scale intended to impress. Beside it, planted areas may have contained trees, shrubs, vines, or other vegetation supported by irrigation and carefully prepared soil. The surviving evidence does not preserve a complete planting plan, and scholars still debate exactly which species grew there and how the complex changed over time. Pollen soil remains, architectural features, and comparisons with other elite gardens offer clues rather than certainty. Yet the broad conclusion is difficult to avoid. Petra contained a cultivated monumental landscape where greenery and open water were part of an architectural experience. In one of the region's driest urban environments, the city created an image of fertility. Such a garden requires far more than occasional watering. Soil must be carried or improved, because bare sandstone cannot support every desired plant. Channels must distribute water without washing the beds away. Roots must be protected from extreme heat, and damaged plants replaced. Gardeners need tools, storage areas, and practical knowledge of shade, pruning, seasonal growth, and irrigation. The garden is therefore not simply a luxury installed once. It is an ongoing expense measured in labour and water. The pool presents an even clearer sacrifice. An open surface loses water through evaporation every day, especially during warm, dry weather. Its walls must be sealed and its level maintained. Dust and leaves collect on the surface. Algae may grow. Sediment must be removed. Water entering too quickly can damage the lining, while a weak supply leaves an unattractive band around the edge. To keep the pool presentable, the city must devote a dependable share of its network to a feature that does not directly satisfy thirst. That apparent waste is precisely what gives the pool meaning. In royal and elite traditions across the ancient Near East and Mediterranean, gardens symbolize order, prosperity, and authority over nature. They evoke cultivated abundance, shaded estates, and controlled fertility. Petra adapts this language to an environment where the symbolism becomes unusually powerful. The garden says that the kingdom does not merely survive the desert, it can make the desert support pleasure. Bathing adds another level of demand. Petra contains bath complexes influenced by wider Hellenistic and Roman customs, where water is used for washing, social activity, and in some periods heated rooms. Baths require storage, drainage, maintenance, and fuel as well as water. A single bather consumes more than the minimum needed for drinking. A public or elite bathing establishment multiplies that consumption across many users. Their existence suggests that Petra's supply can sustain forms of urban life normally associated with wetter regions. Not all residents experience this abundance equally. A monumental pool may shimmer while a household depends on water carried from a neighborhood cistern. Elite gardens can receive irrigation during periods when poorer families must conserve. The hydraulic network is therefore also a map of power. Those who control high-level channels and distribution tanks can decide which spaces remain green and which are allowed to dry. Archaeology rarely records the complaints of people living at the edge of supply, but the contrast between public display and domestic labor should not be ignored. Water must still be carried by hand in many parts of the city. Containers are heavy, steps are steep, and houses may stand above the nearest outlet. Women, servants, enslaved people, laborers, and animals likely perform much of this daily transport, although the surviving record says little about them. The Grand Fountain hides the effort required to keep ordinary storage jars full. Petra's hydraulic achievement is technological, but it also rests on human bodies repeatedly moving water through places the conduits do not reach. The city's cultivated spaces may also serve practical purposes. Orchards and garden plots produce fruit, herbs, vegetables, shade, and possibly wine. Trees reduce heat and stabilize soil. Wastewater from baths or fountains can be directed toward planting beds rather than discarded. A garden associated with power can still contribute food and comfort. The boundary between luxury and utility is not always sharp. What makes Petra remarkable is not that every resident lives amid constant abundance. The city almost certainly experiences shortage, unequal access, and occasional failure. Its achievement is that enough water can be controlled to make abundance visible at all. The pools and gardens reveal confidence in the network, but they also increase its vulnerability. A city displaying water must keep it flowing, because once the fountains fall silent and the greenery withers, the illusion of mastery disappears. Behind that public beauty lies an even more complicated system, including routes whose purpose is still not fully understood. The visible fountains and gardens reveal where some of Petra's water ends, but they do not explain every route by which it arrives. Beyond the most familiar channels, the network contains lines that seem to divide, descend, cross difficult ground, and reappear in places where an ordinary open aqueduct would struggle to function. Among the most intriguing is the system associated with Ain Brak, a spring southwest of Petra, whose water may have travelled toward the city through more than one engineered path. The surviving remains suggest not a single straightforward conduit, but a layered network shaped by changing needs, repairs, and possibly very different hydraulic methods. Ain Brak lies high enough to offer valuable elevation. That height is more than a geographical detail. Water beginning above the city can be directed toward districts that lower sources may not reach, and its stored gravitational energy allows engineers to consider routes impossible for a shallow open channel. Yet the terrain between spring and destination is deeply broken. Ravines cut across slopes, ridges interrupt contours. A conduit following every bend can become extremely long. Vulnerable and difficult to maintain, the direct path, by contrast, may require the water to descend sharply and then rise again. Evidence along the route has encouraged researchers to distinguish between two possible lines. One appears to have followed a more conventional contour, guiding water gradually around the landscape through channels and ceramic pipes. Such a route sacrifices distance to preserve a gentle descent. The second appears more direct and may have crossed lower ground through a pressurized conduit. If this interpretation is correct, Petra's engineers were not simply maintaining parallel channels. They were applying different solutions to the same spring, perhaps at different times or for different destinations. The contour route is easier to understand. It remains high on the slope, curving around natural obstacles and losing elevation slowly. Water flows with an exposed or partially exposed surface, allowing air pressure to remain ordinary. Damage is easier to locate because leakage appears along the route. Workers can remove covers, clear sediment, and patch plaster. Its weakness is length. Every additional bend increases construction and maintenance. Rock falls, erosion, and human interference threaten more sections. A route designed to avoid one ravine may cross several smaller gullies before reaching Petra. The more direct line presents the opposite balance. A closed pipe can descend into a valley and rise along the far side, operating under pressure as long as the receiving point remains below the starting water level. This inverted siphon reduces distance and preserves access to a destination that may otherwise be unreachable. It also concentrates risk. The pipe at the lowest point must withstand substantial internal force. A ceramic conduit may be too fragile unless heavily reinforced. Metal, especially lead, offers greater flexibility and can be joined into a more pressure-resistant line. Fragments and installation features associated with the Ainbrack route have led to the proposal that a lead pipeline once occupied part of the system. The evidence is suggestive rather than complete. Metal was valuable and easily removed for reuse, so an abandoned lead conduit would rarely remain intact for archaeologists. What may survive instead are cuttings, support blocks, impressions, fittings, or traces indicating that a different kind of pipe once lay there. Scholars still debate the reconstruction, and no single explanation fully accounts for every surviving feature. If lead was used, the decision carries important consequences. Producing and transporting enough metal for a long pipeline requires wealth and access to skilled labor. Lead pipes must be formed, joined, supported, and protected from movement. They are heavy, especially across steep ground. Their joints must resist pressure while still allowing the line to follow changing terrain. This is not an improvised village channel. It is infrastructure demanding investment from an authority capable of mobilizing materials and workers on a substantial scale. The choice also implies that the water serves something important. A costly pressurized route might supply a high-status district, a palace-like complex, gardens, baths, or a major reservoir whose elevation makes it strategically useful. The exact destination remains uncertain because later construction, collapse, and erosion obscure the network. Channels are reused, walls are rebuilt. A conduit created for one building may later feed another. Petra's hydraulic map changes as the city changes, leaving archaeologists with fragments from several periods superimposed on the same terrain. The two-route arrangement may reflect redundancy. If the longer contour channel is damaged, the pressurized line can maintain part of the supply. If the siphon fails, the open route provides a less efficient but more easily repaired alternative. Redundancy is valuable in a city where a single break can deprive an entire district of water. It is also possible that both lines operate simultaneously, serving different elevations or balancing seasonal flow. During periods of strong spring discharge, multiple conduits can carry the surplus. During weak flow, one route may be closed to concentrate water in the other. Another possibility is chronological replacement. The older line may have followed a cautious path around the terrain. As Petra grows wealthier and its engineers gain experience, a more direct pressure system may be added. Alternatively, the pressurized conduit could belong to a later phase influenced by Roman hydraulic practice after the kingdom's annexation. Dating individual cuts and pipe beds is difficult because repair work can imitate earlier construction. The city's infrastructure does not preserve a clean sequence, and what looks like technological progress may instead be a cycle of experimentation, damage, and reuse. Operating a siphon requires careful control at both ends. Water entering too rapidly creates stress and traps air. A header tank can regulate the supply before descent. At the receiving end, another basin releases pressure and allows flow to return to an open channel. Vents may be needed at high points, while access to the bottom section is essential for clearing deposits or repairing ruptures. Each additional feature increases the number of places where failure can occur, but it also makes the system manageable. The interior of a lead or ceramic pressure pipe would gradually narrow as mineral deposits accumulated. Spring water leaves carbonate crusts that can build layer by layer, changing the pipe's capacity. These deposits sometimes preserve a record of long use, interruptions, and changing flow conditions. Yet they also threaten operation. A narrowed conduit raises resistance, reduces delivery, and may increase stress elsewhere. Workers must clean or replace sections before the network becomes incapable of supplying its intended destination. What makes the Ainbrack system so revealing is not that it provides a final answer, but that it exposes Petra's engineering as more complicated than the famous open channels suggest. The city may have relied on multiple routes, materials, pressure levels, and stages of rebuilding. Its water network is not a single design completed at one moment. It is an evolving structure in which old desert knowledge, imported techniques, local experimentation, and urgent repair become difficult to separate. That uncertainty leads directly to a larger question: how much of Petra's hydraulic mastery belongs uniquely to the Nabataeans, and how much emerged from the wider engineering world around them? The question of origin becomes difficult because Petra does not exist in isolation. By the time the Nabataean capital reaches its greatest scale, the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East are filled with cities exchanging goods, craftsmen, technologies, religious ideas, and architectural styles. Aqueducts carry water into Hellenistic settlements. Cisterns support communities across the Levant. Dams and flood channels appear in arid regions long before Petra's monumental expansion. Ceramic pipes, hydraulic plaster, settling basins, and pressurized conduits all belong to a wider world of ancient engineering. The Nabataeans are not the first people to discover that water can be stored, diverted, or made to follow gravity. Yet simply identifying a technique elsewhere does not explain Petra. An aqueduct built across a fertile plain does not face the same conditions as one cut into unstable sandstone above a flash-flood valley. A reservoir supplied by regular winter rain is not managed like a cistern dependent on a few violent storms. Knowledge can travel, but it must be altered before it becomes useful. The important question is therefore not whether the Nabataeans borrowed ideas. Almost every successful ancient society did. The real question is how they transformed those ideas to fit a landscape where ordinary solutions could fail quickly. Their closest teachers may have been the desert itself. Long before monumental Petra, communities across Arabia and the southern Levant knew how to identify springs, conceal cisterns, collect runoff, and survive between distant water points. These practices rarely leave spectacular ruins, because many consist of small barriers, cleaned hollows, modified caves, and knowledge passed through memory. They are easy to underestimate beside a grand aqueduct. Yet they provide the conceptual foundation for everything that follows. A person who already understands how water behaves across a dry slope is prepared to enlarge that knowledge into a citywide system. The Nabataeans also control a commercial network through which specialists can move. Stonecutters, metalworkers, plasterers, surveyors, and builders from neighbouring regions may work in Nabataean territory, while local craftsmen travel abroad and return with new methods. Petra's architecture displays awareness of Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Greek, Roman, and local traditions without copying any one of them completely. Columns, facades, capitals, and decorative forms are recombined into a style recognizable as Petra's own. Its hydraulic technology likely develops through a similar process of selective adoption. Hellenistic influence is especially plausible during the centuries when Nabataean power expands. city across the eastern Mediterranean use carefully graded aqueducts, ceramic pipelines, fountains, baths, and formal gardens. Engineers understand the basic behavior of water in open channels and closed pipes. Technical knowledge circulates through practice even when written manuals do not survive locally. Nabataean rulers seeking to make Petra resemble a great capital have both the motive and wealth to employ people familiar with these systems. Roman influence becomes stronger later, particularly after the annexation of the Nabataean kingdom in the 2nd century of the Common Era. Roman cities are famous for aqueducts and public baths, but this reputation can distort the sequence at Petra. It is tempting to attribute every sophisticated feature to Roman intervention, as if the Nabataeans could manage only simple desert storage until imperial engineers arrived. The archaeology does not support such a clean division. Much of Petra's water management develops before annexation, during the period of Nabataean independence and prosperity. The Romans may expand, repair, standardize, or redirect parts of the network, but they inherit a city already shaped by complex hydraulic thinking. Dams, catchments, cisterns, and channels are deeply integrated into the landscape. They cannot all be explained as a late imperial installation. The city's most characteristic achievement, the combination of flood defense, rain harvesting, spring aqueducts, distributed storage, and agricultural runoff control reflects needs that Nabataean communities faced long before Rome took direct control. There is also no reason to imagine a sharp boundary between Nabataean and Roman expertise. After annexation, local workers do not disappear. Craftsmen continue using familiar materials and maintaining systems they understand intimately. Administrators may change, official styles may shift, and new building projects may follow imperial preferences, but the people clearing channels and sealing cisterns are likely drawn from the same regional population. Technologies blend across political transitions more easily than modern labels suggest. Some features may even represent independent solutions to common problems. Two societies facing similar terrain can develop similar channels without one copying the other directly. Gravity imposes the same limits everywhere. Water must descend. Sediment settles when flow slows. Covered storage reduces evaporation. A narrow dam requires less material than one crossing a broad valley. These are not cultural secrets so much as physical realities. What differs is the scale, combination, and precision with which communities respond to them. Petra's originality lies most clearly in integration. A single Roman-style aqueduct would not sustain the city. A collection of traditional desert cisterns would not support monumental gardens and baths. Flood diversions alone would protect structures but leave residents thirsty. The Nabataean system works because these elements overlap. Springs provide relatively steady flow. Storm runoff fills reserves. Terraces support agriculture and reduce erosion. Dams protect the urban centre. Cisterns distribute risk. Pipes and channels move water between elevations. Public basins turn infrastructure into political display. This integration is adapted to uncertainty. In a wetter environment, engineers may design around expected seasonal flow. At Petra, they must plan for years that do not resemble one another. A spring can weaken. A storm can miss one catchment and overwhelm another. A damaged route must be bypassed. Multiple sources and storage points create resilience. That principle may owe more to desert experience than to any imported textbook. Popular accounts sometimes treat Petra's system as evidence of mysterious lost technology, as though its success cannot be explained through known ancient methods. Such claims are unnecessary. There is no need to imagine impossible machinery or forgotten scientific powers. The surviving features are understandable through gravity, careful surveying, skilled masonry, hydraulic plaster, and continuous maintenance. Their achievement becomes more impressive, not less, when seen as the work of human observation accumulated over generations. At the opposite extreme, reducing Petra to borrowed Greek or Roman engineering also misses the point. Techniques are not inventions floating free of place. They become meaningful only when adapted to local rock, rainfall, labour, politics, and risk. The Nabataeans take ideas available across the ancient world and combine them with knowledge developed by people who have survived arid landscapes for centuries. No single explanation fully accounts for every component of the network because Petra is not the product of one people, working in one moment under one influence. It grows through contact, experimentation, repair, and changing ambition. Its water system is both local and international, traditional and innovative. The engineers belong to a connected ancient world, but the solution they create could only have taken its final form in these mountains soon. Another imperial power will inherit that solution and discover that possessing Petra is not the same as understanding how to keep it alive. When Rome annexes the Nabataean kingdom in the year 106, Petra does not suddenly become a Roman city in the sense of being emptied, redesigned, and repopulated from the ground up. The political authority changes, the kingdom becomes part of the province of Arabia, and imperial administration begins to reshape trade, taxation, roads, and public display. Yet the city's water continues to move through channels cut by Nabataean hands. Springs still rise in the same hills. Flash floods still seek the same ravines. Cisterns still require cleaning, and dams still need repair before the winter rains. Conquest can replace rulers quickly, but it cannot replace a landscape or the knowledge needed to manage it. Roman officials inherit a hydraulic system already spread across the mountains. Much of it is difficult to separate from the terrain itself. Channels curve along cliffs, reservoirs lie beneath buildings, and flood barriers stand far beyond the monumental centre. Unlike a palace that can be occupied by a new governor, this network cannot be controlled from one room. It depends on local workers who know where the conduits run, which walls fail after storms, and which cisterns lose water through hidden cracks. Political continuity is therefore partly hydraulic continuity. The empire needs the expertise of the population it has absorbed. Petra remains important after annexation. Imperial roads strengthen connections between the Red Sea, Syria, and the Mediterranean, while the city retains religious, administrative, and commercial functions. Roman-style architecture becomes more visible. Streets are repaved, public buildings modified, and bath complexes maintained or expanded. These changes do not necessarily replace Nabataean traditions. They add new layers to a city already accustomed to combining outside forms with local practice. The water system changes with the urban landscape. A new bath requires a larger and more dependable supply than an ordinary household. A monumental street alters drainage and may block older runoff paths. Rebuilt temples and public buildings need reservoirs, fountains, and channels suited to their new layouts. Existing conduits are redirected, raised, buried, or connected to later structures. Some old cisterns remain in use while others are filled, abandoned, or absorbed beneath construction. The network becomes harder to read precisely because it continues evolving. Roman engineering may introduce new preferences in pipework, distribution, and public bathing, but the empire does not arrive with a single standardized solution that can simply be imposed on Petra. The city's sandstone basin demands adaptation. A technique effective in Damascus or Caesarea may be unsuitable on a slope threatened by sudden torrents. Imperial builders must work within the established hydraulic geography, often using the same spring sources and catchments that supplied the Nabataean capital. This continued use explains why dating individual features is so difficult. A channel may begin in the Nabataean period, receive Roman repairs, and remain active into Byzantine times. Plaster can be renewed many times without changing the basic structure. Ceramic pipes may replace an earlier open trough, then be covered by later masonry. A reservoir can serve a royal complex in one century and a Christian community in another. Archaeology encounters the final surviving condition, not a clear photograph of each earlier stage. The city's fortunes also depend on trade patterns that are changing beyond its walls. Maritime routes through the Red Sea become increasingly important. While imperial roads redirect some movement toward other centres, Petra does not lose all commercial significance at once. But its role within long-distance trade becomes different. The old image of caravans carrying incense through a Nabataean-controlled kingdom no longer describes the political economy. Revenue that once supported royal display and large infrastructure may now flow through imperial systems and competing ports. Reduced commercial dominance does not mean immediate abandonment. Cities rarely vanish at the moment their greatest source of wealth weakens. Families remain. Religious institutions continue. Farmers cultivate surrounding land. Craftsmen work. Merchants trade regionally. And administrators occupy public buildings. The water system allows Petra to survive changes that might otherwise force rapid dispersal. Its distributed storage and multiple sources provide resilience even when maintenance becomes less lavish. Then the ground itself intervenes. Petra lies in a region repeatedly affected by earthquakes, and seismic events damage both monuments and waterworks. Walls crack, columns fall, pipes separate, and channels lose their carefully measured gradients. A conduit does not need to collapse completely to fail. A small vertical shift can cause water to pool in one section and leave another dry. A cistern lining split by movement may leak slowly into the rock. A dam weakened by an earthquake may survive until the next flood tears through it. The earthquake of 363 is often associated with major destruction across the region, and appears to have affected Petra severely. Buildings collapse or require extensive rebuilding, and the hydraulic network must have suffered with them. Yet the city does not simply disappear afterward. Repairs are made, occupation continues, and some districts adapt to the damaged urban fabric. Fallen architectural blocks are reused, streets change function. Water routes are patched or shortened to serve the areas still inhabited. This pattern matters because collapse is rarely a single event. A dramatic earthquake can destroy in minutes, but the deeper decline of a city depends on what happens afterward. If wealth, labour, and political commitment remain strong, damaged infrastructure can be restored. If trade is weakening and population is shrinking, repairs become selective. The most important channels survive while costly fountains are abandoned. A bath may cease operating while nearby domestic cisterns remain in use. Water no longer serves the city in the same ceremonial way, even though it still sustains life. By the Byzantine period, Christianity adds another layer to Petra. Churches appear within the transformed city, sometimes near or within earlier monumental spaces. These communities require water for households, ritual, cleaning, and cultivation. Existing reservoirs and channels continue to offer value, though their routes may be altered to suit a more compact pattern of occupation. The city is becoming different rather than empty. Later earthquakes, including the severe event of 551, bring further damage to the region. Each disaster strikes a network already carrying centuries of repairs. Some sections are restored again, others are bypassed or left to fill with sediment. The distinction between active infrastructure and ruin grows increasingly uneven across Petra. One neighbourhood may still receive spring water, while another depends entirely on local storage. Rome's inheritance, therefore, does not end with a moment of conquest, and Petra's decline does not begin with a single broken aqueduct. The waterworks pass through successive political, religious, and economic worlds. Nabataean channels serve Roman streets. Roman repairs support Byzantine communities. Old cisterns outlive the buildings that once surrounded them. The system remains useful because it is adaptable, but every alteration also makes it more fragmented. Petra continues to live, though the vast coordinated network of its greatest age is slowly becoming a collection of smaller systems maintained by fewer people with fewer resources. By the time Petra's population begins to contract, the water system has already survived centuries of storms, earthquakes, repairs, and political change. Its decline does not begin when one final channel breaks. It begins when the intervals between repairs grow longer. A small crack that once would have been sealed before the next rainy season remains open. Sediment that workers once removed each year is allowed to accumulate. A damaged pipe is bypassed rather than replaced. None of these failures seems decisive by itself, but the network depends on thousands of small parts continuing to cooperate. When maintenance weakens, the system begins to lose that cooperation. Sediment is among the quietest threats. Every storm carries fragments of Petra's landscape downhill. Sand, silt, gravel, and broken stone enter channels, settle behind dams, and collect in reservoirs. During the city's prosperous centuries, organised labour can clear these deposits before they become dangerous. Workers dig out settling basins, reopen blocked conduits, and restore the storage volume behind barriers. Without that labour, each storm leaves a little more of the mountain inside the waterworks. A cistern does not need to collapse to become useless. Its floor can rise beneath layers of mud until it holds only a fraction of its former capacity. The water remaining inside becomes harder to draw without stirring sediment. Organic material gathers in stagnant corners. Plaster hidden beneath the deposits cannot be inspected, allowing leaks to expand unnoticed. Eventually, the chamber that once supported a household or neighbourhood survives only as a muddy hollow. Dams face a similar fate. Sediment fills the space behind them, reducing their ability to slow floodwater. The next storm arrives and finds less room to spread. Water rises more quickly, overtops the structure, and cuts around its edges. Once a breach forms, later floods enlarge it. A barrier that functioned for generations can then become part of the danger, redirecting water unpredictably towards slopes and buildings that were never designed to receive it. Channels fail through neglect in equally gradual ways. Mineral deposits narrow spring-fed conduits from within. Wind-blown sand fills open sections. Rockfalls break covers and expose the flow to debris. Plant roots enter fractures where moisture remains. A single obstruction causes water to back up until it spills across the channel wall, eroding the supporting slope. Farther downstream, residents see only that the supply has weakened, unless workers trace the route and remove the blockage. The line may be abandoned even though most of it remains intact. Earthquakes accelerate every form of decline. Petra's channels rely on carefully preserved gradients, and even slight movement can interrupt them. A section lifted by ground deformation becomes a barrier. Another section drops, creating a basin where sediment settles. Ceramic pipes separate at their joints. Plastered cisterns crack along their walls. Supporting masonry shifts away from cliffs. The damage is distributed across kilometres of infrastructure, much of it hidden or difficult to reach. After a major earthquake, the choice is not simply whether to rebuild the city. Authorities and communities must decide which parts deserve limited labour and materials. A public fountain may be sacrificed so that drinking reservoirs can be restored. A long aqueduct serving a declining district may be abandoned in favour of nearby cisterns. Gardens and baths, once symbols of abundance, become difficult to justify when houses and essential channels also need repair. The water network contracts with the city. Economic decline makes that contraction permanent. Petra's hydraulic system is not expensive only when first constructed. It consumes resources every year. Plaster requires lime, fuel, aggregates, transport, and skilled application. Pipes must be produced or imported. Dams need masonry crews. Remote channels require inspection. Sediment removal demands organised labour at a scale greater than an individual household can easily provide. When trade revenues shrink and political priorities shift elsewhere, the system loses the institutions that once coordinated this work. Population decline creates a paradox. Fewer inhabitants mean less demand for water, but they also mean fewer people available to maintain the infrastructure. A large network designed for a major city may become impossible to justify for scattered communities. Sections that no longer serve occupied districts are neglected, yet their failure can still affect inhabited areas by redirecting floods or cutting off shared sources. The system's scale, once its strength, becomes a burden. Knowledge also fragments. The route of a buried pipe may be remembered by specialists. families, or officials responsible for a particular district. When those people leave, or when administrative records disappear, later residents may know that water once arrived without knowing exactly how. An inspection opening becomes buried beneath rubble. A diversion wall is dismantled for building stone without awareness of the flood path it controls. The landscape slowly forgets the human instructions imposed upon it. No single moment marks the end. Some channels continue functioning long after monumental buildings have fallen. Bedouin communities and later inhabitants use ancient cisterns, repair selected reservoirs, and draw water from springs whose importance predates the city itself. Local knowledge survives even as the coordinated urban network disappears. Petra is not left entirely without water. It loses the ability to manage water at the scale of its former population and ambition. Floods then reclaim routes that had been controlled for centuries. Once diversion structures weaken, runoff returns to old channels or cuts new ones through ruined streets. Sediment buries pavements. Water enters tombs and erodes carved facades. Collapsed walls funnel torrents toward lower ground. Infrastructure becomes archaeology while still influencing the movement of every storm. A broken dam remains a barrier, but now an unreliable one. An abandoned channel still carries water, but perhaps toward the foundations of a monument. The visible ruins can create the impression that Petra was suddenly defeated by the desert. In reality, the desert had always been present, and the city had never conquered it permanently. Petra survived because each generation renewed a temporary balance. Walls were rebuilt, plaster replaced, channels cleared, and flood routes watched. When those acts became less frequent, the natural processes never stopped. Evaporation continued. Sand moved. Earth shook. Rain struck the plateau and rushed downhill. The final failure of Petra's great water system is therefore not proof that the engineering was flawed. Its longevity suggests the opposite. The network worked because it was adaptable, distributed, and repairable. Yet resilience is not permanence. Even the best designed infrastructure depends on communities with enough wealth, knowledge, and reason to maintain it. Once those conditions weaken, small defects begin to join together. Petra does not die of thirst in one dramatic season. Its fountains fall silent one by one. Gardens receive less water. Baths close. High districts depend on local storage. Long conduits become broken lines across the hills. Eventually, the system that once made abundance visible survives mostly as grooves in sandstone, plaster inside dark chambers, and walls standing across dry ravines. Water still passes through the city, but it no longer obeys the complete design. The mountains have begun to take back control. The mountains have taken back much of their control, but the water has not forgotten the routes cut for it. After rain, thin streams still find ancient grooves along the walls of the sick. Cisterns that have stood dry for months darken as moisture returns. Broken channels briefly carry runoff toward reservoirs whose plaster has survived beneath layers of sediment. Dams reduced to fragments continue to redirect part of a flood, sometimes safely and sometimes toward places made more vulnerable by collapse. Petra's hydraulic system is no longer complete, yet it remains active in pieces, influencing the landscape long after the institutions that maintained it have disappeared. This survival creates an unusual problem for archaeologists and conservators. The waterworks are not merely ruins to be observed. They are components of a living drainage system inside a site visited by large numbers of people and exposed to increasingly visible environmental risk. A blocked ancient channel can endanger a monument. A repaired wall can change the route of runoff and transfer danger elsewhere. Clearing sediment from one basin may protect a path while allowing a stronger flow to reach a lower structure. Every intervention must consider not only what a feature was in the past, but what water will make it do during the next storm. Modern visitors often experience Petra under clear skies. The sandstone glows, the ground is dry, and the narrowness of the sick feels dramatic rather than threatening. This calm can hide the scale of the catchment above them. Rain does not need to fall directly over the treasury to create danger. A storm in the uplands can send runoff through connected waders with little warning. The same distant rainfall that challenged Nabataean engineers still threatens residents, workers, tourists, and monuments today. Modern flood control projects therefore revisit many of the same questions faced in antiquity. Where does runoff first gather? Which gullies deliver the greatest volume? How much sediment will a storm carry? Can water be slowed upstream before it reaches the narrow gorge? Where should overflow go if a barrier is exceeded? The instruments have changed. Engineers now use satellite imagery, digital elevation models, rainfall records, computer simulations, and automated warning systems. Yet the physical problem remains recognizably. Nabataean water must be understood across the entire landscape before it enters the city. The ancient diversion near the Sick continues to attract attention because its purpose remains urgently relevant. Restoring or reinforcing such a feature is not as simple as rebuilding it to an imagined original appearance. The ancient catchment has changed. Roads, modern buildings, erosion, collapsed masonry, and altered ground surfaces affect how runoff moves. A channel sized for conditions 2,000 years ago may not safely handle today's flow, especially if storms become more intense or sediment has reduced its capacity. Preservation requires adaptation rather than imitation. Climate uncertainty adds to the difficulty. Arid regions do not become safe merely because average rainfall remains low. A warmer atmosphere can contribute to more intense downpours even where annual totals are limited or variable. Individual storms matter more than averages when water is compressed into narrow valleys. Researchers continue to assess how changing rainfall patterns may affect Petra, and the evidence remains incomplete. But recent flood events have reinforced the need for preparation rather than reliance on historical expectations. Early warning can save lives, yet it cannot protect sandstone by itself. Sirens, monitoring stations, forecasts, and evacuation plans help move people away from the Sick before a torrent arrives. Monuments cannot evacuate. Carved facades remain exposed to water, wind-driven sediment, salt movement, and repeated wetting and drying. Flood control must therefore be combined with drainage maintenance, slope stabilization, archaeological recording, and careful conservation of vulnerable surfaces. Here the Nabataean system becomes both guide and complication. Ancient engineers often placed barriers where the terrain naturally offered leverage. Their catchments reveal watersheds that remain important. Their overflow routes show where excess water was expected to travel. Sediment trapped behind old walls records previous storms. Mineral deposits inside channels preserve evidence of long-term flow. The ruins can therefore function as a hydraulic archive, storing information about how water behaved before modern measurements existed. At the same time, the system cannot be romanticized as a perfect solution waiting to be restored. Ancient Petra experienced failures, repairs, and destructive floods. Its engineers worked for a living city whose residents could clean channels continuously and rebuild damaged walls. Modern conservation operates under different constraints. Archaeological features must be protected even when their original function would require alteration. A damaged ancient dam may be historically valuable but no longer structurally safe. Rebuilding it completely could erase evidence, while leaving it untouched could permit further destruction. The challenge is to preserve both the monument and the knowledge within it. Before repair, structures must be documented. Masonry phases, plaster layers, sediment deposits, and channel connections can reveal how the network evolved. Removing debris without recording it may destroy evidence of past floods. Replacing ancient materials with rigid modern substances can trap moisture or place new stress on softer sandstone. Conservation succeeds only when engineering and archaeology understand that they are working on the same system from different directions. Petra's water network also offers lessons beyond the site. Modern arid cities often seek large centralized infrastructure, deep wells, long pipelines, pumping stations, and massive reservoirs. These can deliver enormous volumes, but they may become vulnerable when energy fails or a single component breaks. Petra demonstrates the value of distributed storage, multiple sources, upstream runoff control, and designs fitted closely to local topography. It does not provide a blueprint that can be copied unchanged, but it preserves principles increasingly relevant in regions facing water scarcity and extreme rainfall at the same time. Its greatest lesson may be that scarcity and flood are not separate problems. The same storm that threatens lives can replenish storage. The same diversion that protects a city can direct water toward fields or reservoirs. The Nabataeans build resilience by refusing to treat excess water only as waste and shortage, only as absence. They connect both conditions through a network capable of slowing, storing, and redistributing what the landscape provides. Today, water still moves beside the paths worn by ancient travellers. It enters cracks, crosses carved ledges, and disappears into chambers whose builders have no surviving names. Some routes are original, others have been repaired, redirected, or misunderstood. Together they preserve the deeper monument of Petra, not merely the facades cut into cliffs, but the invisible agreement that once allowed a city to exist among them. The agreement was never permanent. It had to be renewed with every storm, every cleaning, and every repair. Its surviving traces now ask the same thing of the present to watch the mountains carefully, because the next history of Petra will also be written by water. Petra endures because stone remembers differently from people. Names fade, kingdoms lose their borders, and the roots that once carried incense, metal, cloth, and rumour across the desert become faint lines beneath newer roads. Yet the channels remain. They curve along cliffs where water once moved with deliberate patience. Cisterns wait beneath dust. Broken dams stand in ravines, still facing the direction of storms. Even where the system has failed, its intention can still be read. The city was never a miracle in the sense of escaping nature. It did something more difficult. It learned to live inside nature's limits, without pretending those limits had vanished. The Nabataeans did not create rain, increase the flow of springs, or silence the floods forever. They observed where water appeared, how it moved, and where it could be persuaded to remain. Their achievement depended on knowledge, but also on repetition. Every generation had to clear what the previous storm deposited, repair what the earth had shaken loose, and reseal the chambers that time had opened. That may be why Petra feels both magnificent and fragile. Its facades appear permanent, cut directly into mountains, yet the city behind them depended on plaster, joints, channels, gates, and walls that required constant care. Monumental stone could impress a visitor, but survival rested on smaller things: a cleared outlet, a sealed crack, a correctly measured slope, a worker arriving before the rains. Eventually, the workers became fewer. The fountains weakened, gardens dried, and long aqueducts broke into isolated fragments. Water returned to older paths. Sand settled over streets. The city did not disappear in a single dramatic night. It loosened slowly from the system that had held it together. And still, after rain, Petra changes. Dark streaks spread across the sandstone. Pools form in worn hollows. Ancient channels briefly fill, carrying water past tombs whose occupants have been forgotten. For a few moments, the hidden city becomes visible again, not the city of carved facades seen from the road, but the deeper city of slopes, catchments, reservoirs, and carefully controlled descent. Then the storm passes. The roar in the ravines fades. Water sinks into darkness beneath the rock, and the desert returns to silence. Petra remains between abundance and absence, just as it always has, a city built where water should have vanished, surviving because its people understood that nothing in such a landscape could ever be taken for granted.